for coming in such great numbers to listen to my talk this evening. I want to introduce to you the work of the wonderful still life painter Davidsz de Heem, who was one of the most important artists in his field in this time, and also one of the most influential. But first I would like to give you a short introduction of the Netherlands Institute of Art History, where I work in The Hague. This is the entrance when you come in the building of the Royal Library in The Hague. To the Dutch name is the Rijksbureau voor Kunsthistorische Documentatie. We have several study rooms where you can find a lot of documentation, mainly on Netherlandish painting, but also on foreign art, so on French, Spanish, English, German. And there are a lot of images and photographs, all described with lots of data. We have a large art historical library and also one of the largest catalogs of auction, libraries of auction catalogs in the world. Here you see some of our shelves of books. You see how the photographs are mounted with data on material, sizes, provenance, artist, dating, and nowadays we are also entering a lot of these data into our databases, which are available online through our website www.rkd.nl. And this is the starting page where you can access all the various databases one by one, or one at a time. And you can also search the entire group of databases by typing in, where the blue arrow is, any sort of search word and see what you get. I've typed in here the name of Davidsz de Heem, our subject for tonight, and as a result, you see an overview of the results in, of the various databases, and then you can search in one of the databases for specific results. Now let's choose the database RKD Images, which is the artworks database, and for instance go to page 2, and then you get postage stamp images of a lot of works by or related to the work of Davidsz de Heem. Now, let's choose one of them. And then you get a whole page with all the data for this specific painting. You get a title, you get the measurements, you get the data about the signature, you get a lot of pointers for what you can see on the painting, so all the different objects have been described. And you could, for instance, also search on one of those objects and in the end arrive at this painting if you search in depth. There's a lot of ways to get to a specific result. Now, that is www.rkd.nl if you ever need it. Now here's our subject for tonight, Davidsz de Heem. In a drawing by his colleague Jan Lievens, done in about 1638, so when he was about 32 years of age. The drawing is in the British Museum. It has also been used for a print of a portrait of the artist. And you can see he's depicted here as an important young man in official clothes. A few basic data from his life. He was born in Utrecht in April of 1606 into a family that had moved to Utrecht from Antwerp for religious reasons. And the family name at that time was not yet de Heem, but his father was called van Antwerpen. So the earliest data about de Heem is about Jan van Antwerpen. Then later on he changed his name to de Heem after he had moved with his mother and his stepfather, after his father had died, to Leiden. And that was in the year of 1625. He had already been trained in Utrecht as a painter. In 1625, he also married in Utrecht, but that marriage was still also registered in Utrecht, so he was still sort of between the two cities. And then he lived in Leiden up to 1631, and then disappeared from that city. Probably from 1631 to about 1635, he lived in Amsterdam. There are no archival records that prove this, but as I will show you later on, his work gives the impression that he was working in Amsterdam. And then in 1635, he turns up in Antwerp, also in the company of Jan Lievens, who did his portrait, which you saw earlier on, with Adriaan Brouwer, and we will see more of that later on. And then he's building up an important career in Antwerp, and he stays there until about 1655, 1657, and then he moves back to his city of birth, Utrecht, where he then worked up to 1672. And in 1672, the economical situation in the North Netherlands deteriorated a lot because of the French invasion and a lot of other problems. And then he decided to go back to Antwerp, and he worked there until his death in late 1683 or early 1684. There's no record of his death date, but there is a payment due to his death to the Antwerp Guild in September of 1684, so he probably died in the month or the half year before that. Now, his work is very versatile. It mainly consists of still lifes, but of various subjects and in very different sizes, from this very small still life to something as large as this, and also various types of still lifes, the big, large still lifes, the smaller still lifes, flower pieces, cartouche still lifes, all types of still lifes he did over the more than 50 years that he was active. And tonight I would give you an impression in chronological order of the things he produced. At top left, you see the earliest painting that we know by the artist from 1627. You can see that it's very much influenced by the style that was coherent in Utrecht at that time. Compare, for instance, there's this self-portrait to the right in this painting. He was 20 years at that time. He looks a lot younger there, but maybe it was done on the basis of a younger self-portrait. And then the still life is very much in the style of Balthasar van der Ast, who was most probably his teacher, probably in 1623 to 1625 when he moved from Utrecht. But in the first years of his activity, you see a lot of derivations from the work of Balthasar van der Ast. As you can see here, another very early, still slightly naive work, but also compared with a painting by Balthasar van der Ast. The same type of subject, same type of composition. Here's another one, already 2 years later, 1628. You can see that the composition is still very much based on an earlier work by van der Ast, which is also proof that he must have been a pupil of that painter, because he knew so much about the oeuvre from the first part of the 1620s by van der Ast. But then slowly he's looking around himself and looking at other kinds of paintings. And being in Leiden, he also looks at other artists working in Leiden. And to the right, you see a drawn self-portrait by Davidsz de Heem, who was a very important portrait painter and still life painter. And de Heem must have known his work very well. And you can see that in this still life, there is a very similar oval self-portrait, again a self-portrait of Jan Davidsz de Heem, and a scroll of paper and compasses that are all very similar, and then combined with the earlier influence by Balthasar van der Ast. Then in the same year, 1628, he starts to do a very different type of still life, which may very well have been influenced by the fact that Leiden is a university city, a city of learning, where people loved books, and also his stepfather had a bookshop, and he may well have been offering Jan Davidsz de Heem's small still lifes in his bookshop. The painting from 1629 next to it is much more a vanitas painting, so a memento mori painting. You see a skull there, and again a text on the wall which also says memento mori, so think that you must die eventually. And it also shows that he's very much interested in the fall of light in his paintings. And that's also obvious in this still life in the Rijksmuseum, where you have an important effect of the infalling light and the colors on the books. And it's clearly related to what Rembrandt was doing at the same time. Rembrandt was also working in Leiden. He was also born in 1606, the same year as Jan Davidsz de Heem. Jan Lievens was also working in Leiden at that time. And so they were all mingling together and looking at each other's works and finding the same kind of solutions for their paintings, even though they were working on different subjects. You can see in those years that de Heem is trying various types of subjects, not just still lifes, but also subjects that were a bit beside it. The painting in Oxford to the left, you can see one of his book still lifes on the table, but then in an interior with a figure sitting next to it. Also a sort of melancholy person. Again, a self-portrait, and the last one that we know of him. In those early years, he was clearly very interested in his own image, and later he was not so much anymore. To the right, there is a barn interior, and this was a very new sort of subject. Actually, in Holland, around 1630, barn interiors start to appear mainly in Rotterdam and not in Leiden. But this is an example from 1629, and it's one of the earliest paintings of that subject in Dutch art history. And later, all sorts of other artists start to work on that. he was not only looking at what was painted in Leiden, but also what was going on in Haarlem. In Haarlem, there was the important school of monochrome banquet still lifes on a table in subdued colors. And to the right, you see an example by one of the most important artists of that type of still life, Peter Claes. And you can see that in the painting on the left, that de Heem must have known this still life by Peter Claes, because he was really not copying, but almost copying the various details in it in a very similar composition. By the way, I'd like to mention that when I show paintings in these slides next to each other, I try to give them the proper relative size. So the Peter Claes here is in reality also a little larger than the de Heem. Here's another example of an early table still life by de Heem from 1629, now in the museum in Budapest, next to a wonderful painting by Peter Claes, which is in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And you can see that, again, there are differences, but there's also a lot of similarity. For instance, the choice of objects and the light in the Römer glass is very similar. And interestingly, it's also almost the same metal jug in both paintings, as you can see in those details. So it may very well be that de Heem did visit Haarlem and Peter Claes' studio and made a study of this specific object. By 1632, from the year in which those two paintings were painted, you can see that he built up a much more individual style. In those years, many of his paintings were vertical compositions, upright compositions. They have a certain monumentality. He's very interested in the reflections in metal objects and also in rendering the various textures of the metal and of the fruit and of the shell, of the soft tablecloth. All sorts of things that are very interesting and that he keeps being interested in for the rest of his life. As I said, I think that around this time de Heem was working in Amsterdam, because there's a great similarity with his paintings from those years, from the early 1630s, with the work of a very important artist working in Amsterdam at the time, Jan Jansz den Uyl. And you see here a painting by den Uyl from 1633, next to de Heem from 1635, and you can clearly see the similarities in composition and in subject and in interest. In those years, he's also starting to develop more complex still lifes with various levels in the composition and painting objects not in the same place. And unfortunately, this is one of the earliest examples, but sometime in the history it must have been cut up, and now there are two separate still lifes which can only be reconstructed in a photograph. But you can see that they're clearly part of the same painting originally, also from about 1633. Then by 1639, de Heem had started to develop his specific rich compositions, which he would become famous for later on. Here are two examples, one from probably 1638, one from probably 1639, with important vertical elements, but in a horizontal composition, and he would come back to the horizontal composition again in the late 1630s, and these are the first examples where you can also still see his interest in the shiny objects, in the various textures, in the fall of light. And then this is actually the earliest example of one of his really large, sumptuous still lifes. This was probably done in 1639. You can see that he starts to use all different types of tricks, so to call it, to give depth in the painting and to make it very realistic. He puts a chair in front of the table to suggest depth. He puts a view into a landscape behind the still life, and he also attracts attention by using specific colors, like the red lobster in the center. It draws the attention, and then to the objects that are around it. And also there is some symbolism here as well, because there's the clock in the corner to the right, which indicates the passing of time, that you can have this luxury in life, but time is ticking on, and at some time it will be past, and then you will have to will have to reckon for what you've been doing with your life. In the next years, de Heem painted several of these large, rich still lifes, mostly one every year. This is probably the most famous example, which is now in the Louvre in Paris from 1640, a very large canvas where you also see the same type of composition, with something in front of the table, a landscape background, the musical instruments, which stand for also the fleeting time, because when you make music, it's here and then immediately it's gone. Just like the fruits that are only ripe for a short time and then they wither. There's a lot of these little things that are always present in these paintings. Here's another example of these wonderful large still lifes that he did, this one from 1642. Again, even more rich and even a larger space around it. So the actual still life is a small part of the whole image of richness and of quality and of beauty. Also in those years, he did many much smaller still lifes, but they're only smaller in size, not smaller in quality. They also have the same theme of richness, important, costly objects, costly fruits that had to be imported from other parts of Europe. There were no pomegranates growing in the Netherlands, no lemons, no oranges. They all had to be imported, and they were, of course, very, very expensive. Those large still lifes that de Heem did were also very influential, and everybody loved them. So there were also artists working around de Heem who started to do the same sort of things. The painting on the right is in the collection of the Prado. It is now correctly attributed to Andris Benedetti, who was a pupil of de Heem from the late 1630s, and who became an independent master in 1640. So he really witnessed in the Heem studio the development of this type of still life. And he was really picking that up and starting to do the same thing in the same quality. And there were other artists doing the same thing as well. These two are also both in the collection of the Prado, the same size as the Benedetti, but at least in part by a different hand, but also very much related to the production of Davidsz de Heem from the early 1640s, and they may very well have originated in his studio at that time. You also see some of the same objects coming back in these paintings that you also find in de Heem's still lifes. Then, also in the first half of the 1640s, de Heem started to paint flowers. Most of us know Davidsz de Heem as one of the most important painters of flowers from the 17th century. But in fact, he only started to paint flowers much later in his career. So only in about 1643, 44, he started to paint still lifes. And when he started doing that, he was looking very much at the example of one of the most important flower paintings from that time, Daniel Segers. And I see that on this computer we have a slightly earlier presentation than what I had actually prepared, because this is missing the details for the paintings, but I'll tell you. This is a Daniel Segers from 1644 in the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam. And the de Heem painting to the left is from about 1645, and you can clearly see how he adapts the garland by Daniel Segers. But combines it at the same time with his own still life compositions, and so is really renewing and doing something new. Here are also two early examples of his flower paintings. The one to the right is dated 1645. It's still a rather simple composition, but he's also combining it with smaller still life elements like the fig and the shrimp, and it's in that way becoming something very individual. I think I really have to change something here, because I see that this is really the wrong version of this talk, and we should probably change. There we are. Sorry about this. So here's again the little flower painting, and here are two other early flower paintings by Davidsz de Heem, both from about 1645. One in a private collection and the other in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. But it's interesting that with the painting in the Alte Pinakothek, something has happened. You can see that the painting on the left is much quieter, much more simple in its bouquet, and the one to the right is much more full. And that's because around 1670, an owner probably thought that that painting was a bit out of date, and it was not as elegant as the flower paintings from about 1670. So he asked another painting to make it a bit more modern, and that was Nicolaas van Veerendaal. And what van Veerendaal did is he added several flowers to the bouquet. He reworked other flowers. He added the watch and the ribbon. He probably also added the cherries on the table. So it became much more interesting for a collector in that period. And in comparison, I show you a work that is entirely by Veerendaal, and you can see that the style is very similar. De Heem in his own time was already also copied and imitated a lot. For instance, to the left you see a still life by Davidsz de Heem from 1646, and to the right you see a copy, probably from the same year or slightly later, which is now in a collection in Cyprus. But this is not the only painting that was done after this de Heem example, but there are at least 4 of them. The one at top left was done by Alexander Kozemans. Kozemans was a pupil of de Heem in 1641, and he became a master in 1645, so in the year before de Heem painted this painting, and he must have seen de Heem's original and thought, well, I can do that as well and use it for my own painting. So he changed a few things, but it's still clearly based on Davidsz de Heem's original. Other painters, such as Laurens Kraan, also imitated de Heem's work. You can see to the left here a painting by Laurens Kraan, to the right a painting from about 1646 by de Heem, now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The interesting thing is that Laurens Kraan must have spent some time in de Heem's studio in about 1645, 1646, and then for the rest of his life he kept on painting still lifes in de Heem style from that year. So while de Heem himself changed and developed, Kraan was still doing the same thing 20 years later. And here you see an example also by de Heem from 1646 and a Laurens Kraan from 1643 and 53, and you can see that he was still working in the same style at a high level, of course, but a bit old-fashioned, in fact. De Heem was also trying his hand at other subjects at the time. As we've seen, he would include some landscape backgrounds in his still lifes every now and then. A nice example in this painting, also from about 1656. But then there is this little individual landscape, which might never have been attributed to de Heem if it had not been signed, but it's clearly signed. Unfortunately, it's missing, so I only have a black and white photograph of it. But you can see that it's very much in the same style as the landscape in the background to the right. Same type of farm in the background, same type of trees, same type of light on the clouds. And so he was clearly also trying this sort of thing. We know very little about who were de Heem's patrons and who were the first owners of his paintings, but one of them must certainly have been the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, who was the Spanish governor for some time in Brussels, and who had a big palace there, who had a big art collection. and who was also commissioning Flemish painters from the time to paint paintings for him. And the painting to the left is now coming directly from the collection of Leopold Wilhelm and now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. It is signed and dated by de Heem, 1648, and it also had an inscription which was praising Leopold Wilhelm for his qualities. So that was clearly done, particularly in commission for the Archduke. And the little flower festoon to the right, also from 1648, was also in the collection of Leopold Wilhelm. And it may well be that de Heem initially gifted him with this little painting as a sort of an advertisement. But I'm a good still life painter and I can do this for you, and then hoping to get the commissions. And that is actually what must have happened, because here's another painting which is a collaboration of a number of artists, which was also taken by Leopold Wilhelm from his palace in Brussels to Vienna, and it's now on loan to the church in Luxembourg from the Kunsthistorisches Museum. It was recently restored, and it is a collaboration of several artists, and it's also already described in an inventory in the 1650s. And the flowers in this painting were done by Davidsz de Heem. There's also work by David Teniers, who would become the curator for the collection of Leopold Wilhelm. And the Madonna in the center was done by Gerard Segers, an important history painter. The first half of the 1650s were probably de Heem's most productive and most active years. We know a lot of paintings that he did in that time, mostly in a medium format, and all very elaborate, very detailed, very beautifully done, and he's constantly trying to improve himself. A very beautiful example from about 1651 is here in the Prado, and we can have a closer look at it. You can see how clever he has rendered the various textures, the beautiful silver tata, which is very worked through, the gold watch, the softness of the tablecloth and of the drapery in the background, the hardness and the transparency of the glasses, the transparency of the flesh of the lemon. It's all very well studied, and he studied all those objects again and again for each painting. He never got into a routine. Very interesting is also how he treated the back wall. He works very much with the light on it, and he shows the angle in it, and also he shows the nail that has been hammered into it to the left with the shadow which indicates the direction of the infalling light. There is another still life here in the Prado, the one on the left, which is actually not catalogued as by Davidsz de Heem, but I'm quite sure that it is indeed his work. It has a signature which reads J.D. Kozemas, and as a result of that, it has for a long time been attributed to Alexander Kozemans, who we saw earlier. But of course, the initials are incorrect, and also the N in the signature is missing. So probably this is an original de Heem signature, which was rubbed a bit, and somebody in the late 18th century didn't know who it was by and had a picture by Kosemans and thought, well, we'll add that signature because it looks very much like Kosemans. But if you look at the details and, for instance, compare this painting with the painting from 1652 in the Louvre in Paris next to it, you can see that it's very much the same type of subject, the same quality, the same handling. And yeah, so in my view, most likely a painting by Davidsz de Heem. And it's also interesting that there are at least 2 copies of the Prado painting, both in private collections. One of them signed by this artist Van Dijnem, of whom we know very little, but Van Dijnem specialized in copying and closely imitating still lifes by de Heem. And they are all from about 1652, 1653, 1654. So Van Dijnem must have been in de Heem's studio in those years. And there he also must have copied this still life, which eventually ended up in the Prado. As I showed you in his earlier years, when he was still young, Davidsz de Heem did a few vanitas paintings, so paintings that referred to the brevity of life and the memento mori theme. Then, for the next 20 years, he did no such painting at all. And then suddenly, in about 1652, a few others emerged, like this very interesting painting in Brussels, which is full of symbolism. It has all those elements that refer to the brevity of life, the fact that you will have to, at the end of your life, at the gates of heaven, that you will have to declare for what you have done. So you see the skull, which is again a bit hidden in the middle. You see musical instruments, which show the brevity of life. And even there is the Mount of Golgotha with the 3 crosses in the background of the painting. So again, this is a very inventive composition, and the same is true for the much smaller still life to the right. And yeah, it's very interesting how de Heem worked on the theme of vanitas there by almost completely hiding the skull in the background, but also putting in the withering flowers and other subjects of the brevity of life, but still making it a very attractive and interesting little still life. Yeah, also in the first half of the 1650s, in this very productive period, he was still doing some larger and rich types of still life, but they become a bit less. But this is probably one of the most successful ones from about 1654 in the Academie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna. It again has all the elements in which he can show the quality of his work and the quality of his virtuosity in showing various textures and types of materials, and also a wonderfully spacious composition. Then in 1655, by that time, de Heem had also started on experiment on outdoor still lifes. So not just a little landscape in the background, but really setting his still lifes in a proper landscape. And this is one of the most successful examples in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, signed and dated 1655. And yes, a beautiful example in which he combines fruit and flowers and a landscape background and all these little details with little creepy animals in the foreground, butterflies, everything that he could muster is in this painting. Strangely enough, this is the last painting that he dated for the next 20 years. Up to 1655, his chronology is very clear because almost every year he dated one or several paintings. So also for paintings that do not have a date, you can say, well, this must be from 1651 or 1648 or something like that, because there are always very comparable paintings. And then suddenly he stops dating his work. Also, from that time, in the next 2 years after 55, there are very few paintings. And also in that period, he must have started to move back to the North Netherlands. Instead, his son, Cornelis de Heem, became more active. He was in his early 20s, and he had clearly been educated in the studio of his father and become a very good and excellent still life painter. And we can see that in around the mid-1650s, the quality of Cornelis de Heem's work is very high, because probably he had all the time to spend on his paintings and was in the protection of his father. And then later, when Jan Davidsz had moved to Utrecht and Cornelis stayed in Antwerp, his works become more simple and more coarse, and only rarely are they as elaborate as the early ones that he did in the studio of his father. So then Jan Davidsz de Heem moved to Utrecht, and there he really started to concentrate on flower paintings. He was very interested in details and in atmosphere and in painting a very realistic idea of a bunch of flowers. Well, of course, these flowers are from different seasons, so they could never be put together in this way in a vase. They were all studied separately. And also you see that several flowers return in various paintings. But these two paintings show you very clearly the quality of his work from this early Utrecht period, when he was really trying to create a market for himself in flower painting. Not only flowers in a vase, but also he was doing garlands, like the early example we saw earlier from the mid-1640s, but here much more elaborate and much more lively and much more realistic and much more individual as well. At the same time, he was also still doing his table still lifes in various sizes, also still reaching the same top quality that he was used to, and clearly having good clients. He was by that time also selling to foreign customers. This is another interesting flower painting, because like the one in Munich that we saw earlier, this one has also been modernized, but about 50 years later, in the early 18th century. At first glance, the painting on the left looks completely like a Jan Davidsz de Heem, but then you start to look closer and you see there are several flowers that are quite different. And then when you compare it with a painting by Jan van Huysum, you suddenly see that several of the paintings from Jan van Huysum, of the flowers from Jan van Huysum's painting, appear in the De Heem, which is of course impossible because De Heem was painted 1664 and van Huysum was only painting in the early 18th century. But here in these details, you can see that there are several flowers identical. And so here too, the De Heem was thought to be a bit out of fashion, and someone asked the best flower painter of its time to put some of his flowers in the De Heem painting, and the result is now in the National Gallery in Washington. Well, as you can see, De Heem's flower paintings during this period, they become more elaborate and baroque and lively, and he was very influential. Also still developing new types of compositions, like this interesting still life with a golden cup, with like a cascade of grapes coming into the still life. Nobody else had done that before. Also this type of forest floor still life, which would be imitated a lot and which De Heem did not do very much after that. Much like the early barn still life that we saw, he initiated something and then left it to others to develop. In the mid-1660s, another still life painter came to his studio. That was Abraham Mignon, who had been trained in Frankfurt and then came to Utrecht in the studio of De Heem, and he started to work very much in De Heem style on a very high level, and sometimes it's even difficult to distinguish between the work of the two artists. As you can see here, a De Heem painting from about 1665 and a Mignon also from about 1665. You can see how close they are and how they use the same types of flowers and even use each other's flowers in their paintings. Here's another example where Mignon is completely emulating an example by De Heem. At first sight, it looks entirely the same, but when you start to look at the details, there are very lots of differences in the details, but the idea is the same. And this is also a type of painting that no other artist has done, but that Mignon could only do because he was in the same studio and looking at the example of De Heem. Yeah, here are two more examples of De Heem's work from the second half of the 1680s. And it's interesting to note that the painting to the right is actually described in an inventory in the 1680s as a still life representing the four elements. And indeed, if you start to look, you can see the element of earth in the flowers and in the fruit. And you can see the element of water in the oysters and in the dewdrops and in the water in the glass. You can see the element of fire in the smoldering taper to the right, and also in the porcelain and the glass, which are products of the fire. And then the element of air in the flying insects in the painting. And several of these elements you can also find in other paintings, but less clear than in this one. Again, in this period, De Heem was still experimenting with landscape painting. To the left is one of his most elaborate landscapes known so far. Unfortunately, also only known through a black and white image. I don't know where the painting is. the other, a painting which is actually a combination of landscape and still life and forest floor and nature piece, in the collection of the Prince of Liechtenstein in Vaduz. A very impressive painting by de Heem. And it's very interesting that the flower painting, or the flower elements in this painting, were also the basis for a still life of flowers, which is now in the Thyssen Museum across the street. As I said, de Heem was born into a Protestant family in Utrecht, and he married a Protestant wife in Leiden. But then later on he moved to Antwerp, and he was working for Catholic clients and doing Catholic subjects and working together with other Catholic paintings. Then again he moved to Utrecht, and he was working, for instance, with Abraham Mignon, who was a very devout French Protestant. And he was also doing a lot of still lifes that were bought by people who were friends of the Dutch House of Orange, which was again Protestant. And you also see in still lifes from this time, you see a lot of prominent oranges, which are reference to the House of Orange. And specifically, this painting was done in commission in the praise of the young Prince William III of Orange, who would later also become King of England, and who at that time was getting the stadtholdership back from the government. So de Heem was clearly not a very convinced Protestant or Catholic, but he was moving with his market. And so when he went back to Antwerp in 1672, he was again working together with Catholic painters with a subject like the Christ in Cartouche still life, and again doing that sort of thing. These are beautiful examples of his later work after he returned to Antwerp. I think we have to make a bit of a pace because time is running short. Another interesting example of how he was still experimenting with new types of paintings, these two paintings with the exotic parrot and cockatoo combined into still life compositions. And then finally, after 20 years, in 1675, again, he dated one painting. So that is a very important landmark in establishing the chronology of his works for his last 25 years of activity. And so, for instance, this painting in Leipzig, you can see that it's very much the same in handling and in coloring and even in the type of stone background as this garland from 1675. So this also has to be from 1675. And so it's a point from which we can build up the chronology of his paintings. After 1675, he did not do very much anymore. He was, of course, already about 70 years of age, and still working very meticulously, but of course painting not as much as he used to do. Still working on the various subjects he had initiated earlier. These two are very late works. You can see that it's not as fluent anymore as the earlier ones. It's a bit more subdued, and you can see that he still had more problems in really doing all the details, but it still has a lot of quality and more quality than many others from the same period. These are really the latest works I can find by de Heem, probably done in his very last years. And then eventually in 1683 or early 1684, he died. But he left a very important oeuvre, which was very influential also to a lot of other still life painters. We've seen a bit in this lecture, but there's also a lot more also in other countries. But I hope that I've given you a good impression of the career of Jan Davidsz de Heem, and I hope you've enjoyed looking at these beautiful paintings. Thank you.